Today's conversation is on personal magnetism with respect to relationships, and I would like to discuss this in a way that we have never discussed before. Specifically, I'm referring to an email that I received, which is actually similar to a number of emails that I received regarding a particular video that I released recently while I was in California. It was the video of the quantum leap strategy by Price Pritchett. If you haven't seen it, I'll link in the description to it. Now, the questions, and this particular question is one we're going to zone in on, pertains to a particular part of that video, which I'll play the clip. So it's the part where I walk up to someone on the beach while recording the video and start a conversation with them. And then the conversation flows in a mutually harmonious way. So I see them, I get an intuitive insight to start a conversation with them. I walk up to them, start the conversation with them, and the conversation flows. So the question is, how do you do that? What kind of questions do you say? What do you say to the person when you're starting the conversation, etc.? So what I have found is if a person makes flow a priority, what a person says, doesn't say, doesn't do, happens naturally in a mutually harmonious way. Now, with respect to personal magnetism, this is related to unconditional self-acceptance. Unconditional self-acceptance. And by that I mean specifically, not conditioning yourself. See, you are love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment for no reason at all. Not for this reason or that reason. Not because you're dressed in a particular way or your hair is done in a particular way. For no reason at all. You could assign those labels if you would like. I recommend not doing so. Because then what happens is, intuitively, if you get an insight to start a conversation with someone, you will not have mental chatter appearing in what I call the illusory gap, which is also very much related to the book, The Quantum Leap Strategy. So let's talk about the illusory gap. The illusory gap is not real. It's an illusion. And what it is, let's say a person gets an insight to start a conversation with someone. They may have all of a sudden mental chatter, emotional turmoil, overthinking, and all this, let's say, illusory thoughts appearing in mind that suggest illusions of separation. Maybe what appears in mind is imaginal activity of the person rejecting them. It doesn't mean that you are not love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. As I always say, if they're interested in starting a conversation with me, great. If they're not interested in starting a conversation with me, great. It doesn't change the fact that I am love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. Same with you. You and I are no different. If the person, let's say, appears to give you their phone number, great. If they appear not to give you their phone number, great. It doesn't change the fact that you are love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. Now, what's interesting, as a person embodies their true way of being, their true identity, not generating illusory identities of limitation by relating to the experiences in an inharmonious way, is they embody the fact that they are love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, and it plays out as personal magnetism. Now, with regards to the illusory gap, what happens is mental chatter may appear in mind. So that's what I call the illusory gap. Now, if a person identifies with the mental chatter that suggests illusions of separation, they may hesitate then starting the conversation with the person. They may try to figure out in their mind what to say, what not to say. And all kinds of convoluted behaviors may start to manifest. They may maybe 2 seconds walk up to the person and walk back and then back and forth pace or something like that. That we can say is unnecessary. Now, that kind of behavior or identification with particular thoughts that are illusion of separation-based thoughts, suggesting not love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, is generating a physical gap of time, we could say, between the person receiving the intuitive insight to start the conversation and starting the conversation with the person. So, intuitive insight, conversation started. There's actually no gap, no separation in between. The illusory gap is the mental chatter that's appearing in mind. So what can a person do? Well, what I found is exactly like how he talks about in the quantum leap strategy, is to take the step anyways. Anytime intuition arises within me over the years, and I practiced this over the years, through the practice, you close the gap. Through the repetition of taking the intuitive step again, again, and again, the gap closes. So what happens then? Practically speaking, you see someone that you're interested in starting a conversation with, you walk up to them and start a conversation. And the conversation appears as a magnetic conversation, a flow-based conversation. And also, what's interesting about that is by unconditionally accepting yourself as love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, people also seem to come up to you and start conversations with you. So I remember having a conversation with one of my friends about which is better. Is it better to walk up to a person and start a conversation with them? Or is it better to have people walk up to you and start a conversation with you? And I said to him, I personally don't have that bias. And because I don't have that bias, both of them happens. Sometimes I feel an intuitive insight to walk up to someone and start a conversation with them. No agenda. I genuinely feel like starting a conversation with them, and the conversation flows in whatever direction. It may flow in friendship, it may flow in dating, it may flow in business, it may flow as an interesting conversation that we have for a minute, and maybe I'll see them around town. There's no attachment to the outcome, because whatever happens ideally, automatically, naturally to be in my favor. So, at times, intuitive insight arises, start the conversation. I walk over and start the conversation. And at times, people appear to me, they walk up to me and start a conversation with me. So, it doesn't matter. One I don't consider to be better than another. Why would I think that? Because let's say if I thought it was better for me to sit around and wait for people to start a conversation with me, and then an intuitive insight arises to start a conversation with someone, I may end up forcefully holding myself back from starting that conversation, which is completely illusory. It's just identifying with programming within that illusory gap, which again, the programming is not real and the illusory gap is not real. So in other words, I'm not being as I am. I'm not flowing by not allowing myself to start that conversation, by forcing myself to sit there and do nothing, even though genuinely I feel like starting the conversation. Why would I generate that illusion? It is the result of identification to a particular belief that suggests that you must have people come up to you to talk to you. That's better. Or on the flip side, actually, at a particular point, you come to the realization that one way is not better than another. And you naturally flow. And by that I mean, if you see someone you're interested in starting a conversation with, you walk up to them and start a conversation with them. Sometimes when you're out and about, people walk up to you and start a conversation with you. All of that is a natural result of personal magnetism. So then let's get to the core of what's really going on here. What do you say? What do you not say? What do you do? What do you not do? If you would like a very simple response from me as to what to say, generally, and again, the answer is depends, but generally I find myself talking about whatever's in the environment. So for example, in that conversation, I walked up to her and talked about the beach, talked about my stay in Redondo Beach, talked about making the video, etc. What I find is it naturally tends to be about the environment, the experience, and it's not me fishing for ideas of what to talk about. That's just what it ends up happening to play out as a conversation that what I have seen is generally about the environment. Now, this is not to form a bias and say, because Joseph said, talk about what's in the environment, that is what I have to do. That happens naturally. But I find, and I recommend this to people actually, if, let's say, they're having a hard time with that illusory gap and they want to connect in the intuitive insight with the step that start a conversation like that from the perspective of talking about whatever is in the environment and then allowing it to flow from there can be very helpful to close that gap. Because as mentioned, I have over the years practiced closing that illusory gap, which is not a real gap. You see what I mean when I say it's not a real gap, it's an illusory gap. What I mean, practically speaking, is that a person gets an intuitive insight, they desire to start the conversation with someone, but then they may experience fear, doubt, indecision, uncertainty, which is a result of identification to particular beliefs. And so in the moment, if those thoughts appear in mind, don't identify with them and start the conversation with them. Now, there's a wonderful book actually called The 5-Second Rule. I'm considering discussing it by Mel Robbins. That could be very helpful. We'll get into the nuances when we get into that discussion. So over the years, I've taken the step again, and again. And then what happens is all those beliefs in the illusory gap that are suggesting illusions of separation dissolve. Emotions are released in a natural, authentic way. In other words, you see someone you're interested in talking to, like a child, you feel excitement perhaps, maybe a little bit of fear, which is totally fine. I feel the fear anyways, allow the fear to be released, and start the conversation with them. Now, what I also find is this is flow enhancing for me, because essentially I'm honoring the flow. You honor the flow by doing the things that you genuinely desire to do. See, it's not like I'm saying to myself, you have to start the conversation with this person. If you don't start the conversation with this person, then you're a bad person. Then you are not love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. There's no conditions. I genuinely feel like starting the conversation, so I start the conversation. You genuinely feel like starting the conversation, so you start the conversation. Now, what is generating the personal magnetism, we could say, is unconditional self-acceptance. And by that I mean, very specifically, you are love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment for no reason at all. Not because you started the conversation, not because you did not start the conversation, for no reason at all. Not because of the way you are dressed, not because of your communication style, for no reason at all. Existence itself is love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. In other words, you accept yourself the way you are, regardless of conditions, as love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. This plays out automatically and naturally as personal magnetism, the magnetic personality. Because we could say then, the magnetic personality or personal magnetism is one that demonstrates not needing approval, validation, or confirmation of being love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. So a person is not seeking that with regards to starting the conversation. In other words, they're not walking up to the person, asking them subconsciously to validate that they are love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. They're starting a conversation with the person because they feel authentically like starting a conversation with the person. Personal magnetism. During the conversation, because there is no identification to illusory beliefs that suggest that they are not love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, they don't end up seeking for that in the conversations with the person externally. The conversations flow in a mutually harmonious way. The other person feels relaxed, at peace, at ease, and they find you interesting. They find you interesting for many reasons. One of the reasons we could say is they love the fact that you accept yourself unconditionally as love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. Now, the same is to be said if someone comes up to you and starts a conversation with you, because you're not needing anything from the person as far as approval, validation, or confirmation goes of the fact that you are love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. The conversation flows. If it goes in direction A, great. If it goes in direction B, great. If it goes in direction C, great. Because you know certainly that everything appears in harmony to play out as harmonious relationships, some way, somehow. Harmonious relationships that reflect the fact that you are love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. So the practice is removing the conditions which appear only in mind. You are unconditional love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. As mentioned, for no reason at all. The fact that you exist is love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. And I say this with repetition for good reason. Because as you hear this again, again, and again, prior to interactions, during interactions, and after interactions, you are aware of what thoughts you identify with prior to the interaction, during the interaction, after the interaction. And if it's illusory thinking, as in not love, not happiness, not peace, not bliss, not fulfillment, which is not you really thinking, that kind of thinking belongs to what the Bible refers to as the old man, and you are not the old man. If you don't identify with that thinking, you notice that the conversation flows. Mind is purified. So consider then, starting conversations with people, engaging with people, is a spiritual catalyst. It is an opportunity for mind purification. As the mind gets purified, the illusory gap dissolves. So then, practically speaking, wu wei. You may do, you may not do. You may say this, you may not say this. You don't overthink it. It happens. It flows naturally. And it also happens to be in mutual harmony with the other person. I trust you've noticed this. There have been times in our lives where this was very, let's say, obvious. The behaviors I'm talking about, the personal magnetism. Our natural, inherent personal magnetism was flowing. But maybe at a particular point, a person began identifying with illusory thinking, which belongs to the old man. So they, in other words, were not really thinking for themselves. Then all of a sudden, convoluted behaviors, overthinking, hesitation to start the conversation, don't know what to say, what to do, etc. Convoluted behaviors started to happen, and maybe they shamed and condemned themselves for these behaviors, which I suggest not doing. I suggest accepting yourself in the moment the way you are, as love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment for no reason at all, by being still. Stillness means love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. Silence means love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. What you do, don't do, love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. And then what happens is those illusory beliefs dissolve. And then a person's back in their flow again. So being in flow helps tremendously when it comes to starting conversations, flow-based conversations, and having wonderful, harmonious relationships. There are many ways to access the flow. I access the flow by taking the intuitive step into the flow. If the desire arises to start the conversation with the person, I start the conversation with the person. I don't overthink it. If there are emotions that arise, let's say fear mixed with excitement, if a person labels them that way, energy in motion, that's fine. I allow the emotions to be released and I start the conversation. I also can transmute the emotions. Anxiety can be transmuted into excitement by setting the intention that this is how the relationship plays out. This is how the conversation plays out as a harmonious relationship. And then you flow right into the conversation. And through the repetition of doing this again and again and again, mind gets purified from illusory beliefs that suggests not love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, that we could say stifle the personal magnetism, and that illusory gap closes because it's not real to begin with. and then you naturally flow. What you say, what you don't say, what you do, what you don't do happens naturally, or as I say sometimes, ideally automatically, to be in harmony with the other person. Mutual, harmonious conversation, etc. So, through the repetition of starting conversations over the years, I've done this in business, I do this when I'm out and about, I do this online, I may reach out to people. Repetition, again and again and again, I get to practice being aware of what I was identifying with prior to the conversations, during the conversations, and after the conversations. And if it was illusory thinking, illusory beliefs of separation, I stopped identifying with it. I did not identify with it, and those beliefs that were generating those illusory thoughts dissolved. And then what happens? You see someone that you're interested in starting a conversation with, you start a conversation with them. And what's fascinating about that is because through this process, you accept yourself more and more so as unconditional love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, is there's no attachment to outcome. One has the burning desire to start a conversation while being detached from the outcome. What could appear as a contradiction? Wait, burning desire, detachment from outcome? How could you have both? As a matter of fact, I have both. What happens is I have a burning desire. Let's say you're attracted to someone. You have a desire to start a conversation with them. If you didn't have that desire, that attractiveness towards the other person, let's say, if you didn't feel attractive or chemistry towards the other person, you could say, why would you start the conversation if you are interested in, let's say, dating or relationships? You probably won't. You'll go on to do other things because that's not of interest to you genuinely. Maybe you see someone that is doing something just out of sheer curiosity. You want to start a conversation with them. That's fine as well. But let's say you have the burning desire to start a conversation with someone because you feel chemistry towards them. You can walk up to them and start a conversation with them. Now, this is where the detachment from outcome comes into play. Because what I've found is that over the years, through practicing this, if the burning desire is there, great. I start the conversation. And I'm still detached from outcome. In other words, if they give me their phone number, great. If they don't give me their phone number, great. If they say, let's meet up for coffee, great. If not, great. If I ask them out and they say yes, great. If they say no, great. Detached from outcome. Because I am love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment for no reason at all. I act on intuition. Now, what we find as a result of it is the personal magnetism seems to, let's say, or so it appears that way, generate more dates, more relationships. So you genuinely feel chemistry towards someone, you start the conversation, burning desire plus detachment from outcome. As in, if it goes this direction, great. If it goes in that direction, great. If it goes in whatever direction, great. Interestingly, we find that the chemistry is allowed to flow naturally between the two people. And the other person feels chemistry more so. Maybe they felt it before. Maybe by you presenting yourself as being magnetic, by acknowledging that you are unconditional love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, stimulated by desire, that chemistry was always there within them, gets activated, and they feel that as well with you. So that's the power of what we're discussing here. So in recap, consider this. It is helpful to close that illusory gap. If you're interested in starting a conversation with someone, start the conversation with them. Close the illusory gap. Number 2, remove attachment from outcome. If it goes in direction A, fine. If it goes in direction B, fine. If it goes in direction C, fine. Release identification that it has to be this way or that way to determine, which is seeking approval, validation, or confirmation of love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, which is the fact that you exist. So you don't need to seek it. The fact that you exist is love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. Now, every opportunity that we get to start a conversation with a person prior, during, and after conversations with people, so prior to conversation, while you're having a conversation with the person, or after having a conversation with the person, you can be aware of the kind of thinking that appears in mind. And if it's illusory, suggesting illusions of separation from love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, in some kind of imaginal activity that implies in mind, don't identify with it. And mind is purified. And you accept yourself the way you are. Unconditional self-acceptance. Also, I recommend removing the bias, which has been very helpful for me as well, and many that I've worked with over the years in this area. The bias of one way being better than another. In other words, in relation to the example that I gave earlier, is it better to, if you feel attraction towards a person, walk up to them and start a conversation? Or people walking up to you and starting a conversation, and that's how the conversation flows. Personally, I don't consider one way better than the other. I had that conversation with my friend. He released identification to that particular belief that was suggesting one way is better than another, because what he was suggesting is that waiting for people to come up to you and start a conversation with you is the best way, and that he should not go and start conversations with a person, which was an identification to an illusory belief, which we could say he was just guarding himself because he was afraid of rejection. And I had this conversation with him, and this is what we found. So once he released that illusory belief, what would happen was he would walk up to a person that he was genuinely interested in starting a conversation with him. He would start the conversation would flow, and people would still come up to him and start conversations with him. So best of both worlds. I don't consider one way to be better than another. So personal magnetism is the natural result of being as you are. And being as I am, love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, it naturally plays out as what you say, what you don't say, what you do, what you don't do. While you're out and about, you see someone and you want to start a conversation with them, or if you're out and about, people come up to you and start a conversation with you. And then let's say if they do come up to you and start a conversation with you, you're not guarded, you're not defensive, you are exploratory, and if you would like to have a conversation with them, great. If you would like not to have a conversation with them, great. You don't shame yourself, condemn yourself, force yourself to do anything that you don't genuinely desire to do, because you're being as you are, as love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. So I trust you found this video to be helpful. If you would like more videos or you have any more questions with respect to what we've discussed here, feel free to leave a comment below and we can explore in upcoming videos. Let's conclude this with an auto-suggestion to further encourage. You could say, I am love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment for no reason at all. The fact that I exist is love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. If I see someone that I have a desire to start a conversation with, I start a conversation with them from a state of flow, and the relationship flows in a mutually harmonious way. People appear to start conversations with me that are in mutual harmony and in contribution. All of this increases more so each day with increasing frequency on a continuous basis as far as the senses perceive, to reveal heaven on earth as ideal, harmonious relationships.